Happy Three Tune Tuesday. Shout out to Abe Blaze for hosting and organizing as usual. You guys know it's my favorite day of the week, doing music posts. I even started doing a 4-tune Friday. Just myself. Nobody else is really doing it. Just because I love doing the music picks so much. But yeah, anyway. A lot of times I pick eclectic bands. I try to, pick like the lesser known stuff, when I'm doing punk rock. I don't just go for the best of the best, the most famous rather, I go for more of the underground, try to share some new stuff with you guys. But honestly, I figured, you know what? Let's just go with the big boys. I kind of avoid doing that when it comes to a lot of different music. Try to showcase, just stuff a lot of people won't know. So let's go with the Ramones. I got to be honest, my favorite Ramones songs are mostly on later albums. Their third album, Rockets to Russia, which is only a year after their first one. Their first three albums came out in the first 2 years. The Ramones, simply self-titled. That has, the Blitzkrieg Bop, Drive It in the Backseat, the Blitzkrieg Bop. It has Beat on the Brat, Judy is a Punk. I Want to Be Your Boyfriend's kind of a slower song. And then most of the other songs are much lesser known. I actually think the third album, Rockets to Russia, is a better album. You got the Cretin Hop, you got Rockaway Beach, Sheena is a Punk Rocker, Teenage Lobotomy, Do You Want to Dance? These are all songs that were that are kind of generally on the best of albums, the compilations. And then Road to Ruin was the fourth album. I Want to Be Sedated's on that one. That's the one a lot of people know. But then there's, it's very interesting. The ones that make the best of albums, which is what I bought as a kid, it's very spaced out. There's a lot of songs that people really generally don't know. But let's go with, for the first pick from 1976, self-titled Ramones album. Well, let's go with Judy is a Punk. I don't want to go with the one everybody knows. Judy is a Punk. Judy is a punk. Na na na. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. So let's go with that. Let's do two from America, two from London. 3 plus a bonus. But I will mention the Misfits, which it's so weird trying to find out like where certain songs come from, because you can only find the Misfits like pre-1988 songs on compilations. Nothing's on streaming. And you try to find an album with like, oh, what album was this song on? And a lot of it's like singles and 7 inches, and they had recorded in 1977. If they had just put out a full length album on like a decent independent label, they would have been way bigger, and I think they would have gotten a lot more credit. I mean, I've always heard of the Misfits, But yeah, you go to try to look up any of their songs. Hybrid Moments from Static Age, 1995. No, that song's from the early 80s. And you go to their first album, it's just all screwed up on streaming. First album, 83, next album, 97, then 99, 2003, 2011. It's just weird. It's just weird. Singles and EPs. 2002 is the first one. Compilations. Now you'll find all the classic songs, but it's really hard to tell where they're from. Let's check this out really quick. Initially known as Misfits, this 1986 compilation is among the essential releases from New Jersey's most wonderful horror punk band. Blah, 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 blah. Yeah, it doesn't say anything about but it's you can't find like any like essential for this album had these songs, you know, like with the Sex Pistols, you know, never mind the Bollocks, right? That was their first album. Let me go to Sex Pistols. We'll do Sex Pistols for number 2. But again, they only had one real album. They did have some other songs that have been released later and some released at the time. But never mind the Bollocks, here's the Sex Pistols. Was their, it says 1977. I thought it was 76, but I guess it was early 77. You know, God Save the Queen, Anarchy in the UK, Pretty Vacant, EMI, Holidays in the Sun. And then they had a couple songs that were like singles, but they actually only have one full-length album. The Great Rock and Roll Swindle, Sex Pistols, 1979. And this is not featuring Johnny Rotten, their lead singer. Johnny Be Good, Lonely Boy, The Great Rock and Roll Swindle. And, you know, they have a couple covers where, what's his name, sang, that Frank Sinatra cover. You know, Sid Vicious sang. And Sid Vicious wasn't even the original bass player. If I'm not mistaken, he did not play on the first album. He joined afterwards. And, you know, it was just kind of a distraction. So, yeah, I don't know. The Sex Pistols were huge and actually had, like, a big label. And, you know, the Ramones didn't really get commercially huge. You know what I mean? Like, you know, they got some attention throughout the years, and there were different periods where they got more attention or less. But they were never really huge. Like you didn't hear them on the radio off their 1976 album. Where the Sex Pistols, it seemed like they were actually promoted as like a big artist, you know, and the Clash were commercially viable. Now, I think the Clash were a little less straight up punk. You know, the Ramones really didn't get the same commercial success that the Clash and briefly the Sex Pistols did. And, you know, Johnny Rotten, you know, I've heard the guy can be a real asshole. You know, when he hits the bottle, you know, I've heard at different conferences, different like Henry Rollins was talking about it, how they had a panel talking about punk. One of the Ramones was there. And Johnny Rotten was just being a total dick as soon as the cameras turned on. But in terms of turning his back on, you know, not wanting to sell out, he did leave the band. And he started Public Image, which was kind of a post-punk band. They're a lot more famous in Britain. And, you know, he does something kind of totally different, you know? So, yeah, it's weird. It's weird. The Sex Pistols, though, you got to give them credit. Just to mix it up, I'm going to do the song Pretty Vacant, track 10. That'll be pick number 2. And then I'm really debating on who to pick for the second New York band. Because, you know, you got the CBGB scene. Blondie wasn't punk. And Blondie ended up having a bunch of number 1 hits. Doing a disco song, doing a lot of pop. And literally being one of the biggest bands in the late 70s, early 80s. But, you know, this is before, you know, the Dead Kennedys and all that stuff. So let's go The Clash. You know, again, covering the big boys. Let's go their first album, 1977. And let's go I'm So Bored with USA. I'm so bored with USA. And, you know, since we can't really point to, like, one Misfits record, because it's just, like, a lot of it was just on, like, different EPs and singles and 7 inches, and you literally cannot get, like, the early albums on streaming or anything, and it's kind of a bummer. I'm going to go with the Dead Boys for bonus jam. So we got 2 bands from London, 2 from New York. And the Dead Boys came out a year later in 77. So the same year as the Sex Pistols and the Clash. And the Dead Boys get no love. everyone talks about the Ramones and the Pistols, and then, oh yeah, the Clash. Maybe because the Clash, kind of put some reggae and some pop, in their later records. But, they were a form of punk. But in terms of what actually, like, punk was, the Dead Boys, sound-wise, are just, to me, just as iconic as the Sex Pistols. They had the same amount of albums. Young, Loud, and Snotty, 1977. Sonic Reducer. I'm going to go with the opening track. I've probably shared this song in the past, but not in a long time, and it is a bonus jam, so I think the Dead Boys should be right up there with the Ramones, the Pistols, and the Clash. Especially the Pistols, because they only put out one album, and they're known as like, oh, it's the Sex Pistols, for whatever reason, in Britain, they just got more mainstream success. The Clash, they had a bunch of hits. Again, they kind of morphed and evolved, but so did the Ramones, and they never really got the fame and credit, I think, commercially they deserved. They had some minor hits, but just a very different vibe. But yeah, the Dead Boys, I think they're just as important as the Sex Pistols in terms of the actual music. So yeah, those are the two bands from New York and two bands from London. Most of the so-called punk bands, really came in, like when you think about 80s punk, there really weren't many other bands. They all came out like in 79, 80, 81. That was like the Dead Kennedys, Social Distortion, The Adolescents, Black Flag. Those bands started in the late 70s, put out albums in 79, 80, 81. And a lot of them only put out one album. And the Dead Boys really, honestly, sound more like that music than the Ramones, Pistols, or Clash. And they just kind of burned out, I think it's a famous story. The owner of CBGB's actually picked them thinking they'd be the ones that would break commercially. And, over the Ramones, Blondie, and Talking Heads, obviously a lot more than just punk. But those were the CBGB bands, Television. And, obviously the Talking Heads, Blondie were huge. The Ramones, probably next up. Not commercially like megastars or anything, but, had a good career. The Dead Boys, he picked them to be the one that would break and be huge, be like the America's Sex Pistols, basically. Or I guess really this would have been before the Sex Pistols blew up, because they would have probably recorded this in 76. But yeah, they kind of burned out, But the Dead Boys, you got to put them up there, because just listen to Sonic Reducer. This sounds more like what was to come than the Ramones even. And by the 80s, the Ramones sounded... They were doing like poppier stuff that I think should have been hits. Their song Pet Sematary from 1989, kind of like the end of the career. They broke up in 94, put out an album called Adios Amigos, where Johnny Ramone only sings on half the songs. One of the newer Ramones comes in and sings like 3 or 4 of the songs, and, they share vocals on a third of the album, and then, basically he had checked out. But, Pet Sematary, it plays in the end credits of the movie. The Ramones had Bonzo Goes to Pittsburgh in 1985. Definitely produced like more of a pop vibe. I actually it's probably one of my favorite Ramones songs. I Just Want to Live, that was 83, 84. And Something to Believe In. The Ramones had some really poppy, catchy tunes that really didn't do much. And in my opinion, are some of the best songs ever written. But for this post purpose, we want to cover 76, 77. The Ramones were definitely before the Pistols and the Clash. and they got the least love commercially. You know, a little bit of play on MTV with, you know, I Want to Be Sedated, and probably, you know, a little bit of radio play with some other singles here and there, but nowhere near what the Clash did, or Blondie, or the Talking Heads. You know, I know the Talking Heads and Blondie are not punk, but they came from that CBGB scene, and the Ramones obviously are mega respected. I mean, even when I was growing up in the 90s, the Ramones were already legendary. But I feel like they've become even more legendary. Like, they'd be millionaires today just based on merch, on licensing deals, because, you know, so many people, they're just such an iconic band. People wear their t-shirts, and, you know, I felt like that was already the case, but truthfully, they were not rich. They made a living, no doubt about that. But, you know, they had no top 40 hits. You know, maybe I Want to Be Sedated cracked the rock and roll charts slightly on the bottom of the 40. I'm not sure. But nowhere near top 10, nowhere near that kind of success. And they started it all, you know. But again, the Dead Boys, I feel like they should be on that list. Maybe they just burned out and didn't play enough, you know. Maybe it's their fault. But I feel like if you're going to put the Sex Pistols on such a, like, you know, the Mount Rushmore, the Dead Boys should be there too. I think Sonic Reducer's probably one of the best punk songs of the 70s. And again, it's more like what was to come than the Ramones were. And I love the Ramones. Special shout out to the Misfits. From what I understand, the story is they had a deal. They recorded an album in 77, and it wasn't released for like 4 years. It was something crazy weird like that. So who knows? I mean, the Misfits were always a known band growing up. I think they've even become more legendary. And they're just lacking that you know, that first album that can be cited, because they had, you know, everything was released on these singles and, you know, smaller releases, and you know, they don't really have this one iconic album that has, you know, their 70s songs. You know, it's kind of unfortunate. I think otherwise they would be easily equal to the Ramones. But anyway, what are you gonna do? Enjoy the tunes. I tried to pick some, you know, not the biggest songs from each band, but you probably know most of these bands. And shout out to the legends and the forefathers of punk rock. I'm thinking about doing an extra bonus jam from Iggy Pop. Just because I was going to do him for the second New York band, but I feel like it was a different thing. Their first album came out in 1969. Punk wasn't even around yet. So yeah, I'll leave it as is. I'm gonna leave it for one bonus for 3 Tune Tuesday. But I love you guys. Hope everybody's good. Later.